For us as people, place is very important. The place where we grew up, the places where we went to school, our first place of work, our favourite holiday place. For me, a special place in my life is Keith in the Upper South East. It was there that I began my teaching career. It was where Helen and I had our first home, where our children were born, and where I received my call to ministry. As is the case here in Victor Harbor and other places where we've been, we have also had Christian friends as members of the Uniting Church. And on one occasion, on a trip home from Queensland, we dropped into Keith, and while we were there, we spent some time visiting Gary and Pat Forrest, farmers who lived across the paddock from where we used to be in Keith. And while we were talking with them, they made mention of the new Uniting Church minister in the town, the Reverend Nick Hawkes. Sadly, Nick is no longer with us. He passed away 3 years ago after a battle with cancer. While in Keith, Nick wrote a book called The Country is Different. And I got to know Nick, and we spent a few occasions together at different conferences and things. But in this book, he has a rural reflection entitled The Rabbit Trap Cross. And this is what it says. There's a rabbit trap sitting in the corner of a shelf in my study. It's old and rusty. The frame of the trap is shaped in a cross. Whenever I'm tempted to forget that it doesn't matter much to God what I do, or that Christianity is just people doing nice things, I look at that rabbit trap cross. It's cruel, it kills slowly, it's just like the cross on which Jesus died. If words were enough to tell us of God's love, God would have shouted down from heaven. As it was, God sent his son Jesus to show us what God was like and to die on a cross for us, to take the blame for the bad things that we have done that would otherwise keep us from a holy God. Love cost God a lot. Let's not disregard it or take it lightly. When I read those words, and given that this is Easter, they struck a chord with me. A rabbit trap. While there are still plenty of them lying around on farms collecting dust and cobwebs and rusting away, I find it interesting that they are no longer allowed to be used because of the suffering that they inflict on the trapped animal. Perhaps today of all days, when we remember Christ's suffering on the cross for us as Australians, the rabbit trap is a most appropriate symbol. The cross is the most significant symbol of Easter. And to help us as we think about that this morning, I want to mention a mnemonic, special words taken from each of the letters of the word cross. C, standing for crucifixion. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described crucifixion as the most wretched of deaths. Crucifixion was a punishment reserved mainly for slaves and violent criminals and those who dared to offer resistance against Rome. In fact, such was the horror and cruelty of crucifixion as a form of punishment that its effect as a deterrent to one's behaviour was extremely powerful. Apart from the torture that often occurred prior to the victims being crucified, there was the humiliation of one's being publicly exposed to ridicule and show. And as if that wasn't enough, victims were often left to hang on the cross rather than be buried where wild animals and birds of prey could get at their bodies. Crucifixion certainly was not a pleasant way for Jesus to die. R stands for redemption. The Universal Dictionary defines redemption as the recovery of ownership. In the theological sense, it is salvation from sin through Jesus' death on the cross. The Apostle Paul, in writing to the Romans, says, "For all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But God presented Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement for each of us. He made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." In other words, Jesus deliberately allowed himself to be killed so that each of us might be shared the shame and the penalty of our wrongdoing. Jesus was our sin bearer. He paid in full the penalty of our sin. He was our substitute, hanging on that tree instead of you and me. The result of this act of redemption was to place us in a position of wholeness and purity before God, to be seen as righteous. The full penalty of God's law had been paid and God's justice totally satisfied. But having said this, though, there's a question that each person needs to answer. Do you believe that Jesus has done this for you? And if you don't, what are you going to do about it? Crucifixion, redemption, O stands for obedience. It was on the cross where the greatest possible piece of service would be accomplished by the greatest possible number of people, by the greatest possible person of all. And yet this wouldn't have happened if Jesus had chosen to go against his Father's will. His words to God on the Mount of Olives, "Yet not as I will, but as you will," show that he was aware of the pain and the suffering that awaited him. But in spite of this, he was willing to fulfill God's plan. Jesus' words to his disciples, recorded in John chapter 15, are these, beginning at verse 9. "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." If Jesus had not been obedient to his Father and allowed himself to be crucified for all mankind, then there would be no forgiveness for sin, no hope, no Easter. S stands for suffering. And the prophet Isaiah, many years before Jesus' crucifixion, wrote words that we've already heard and seen this morning from Isaiah 53. That Jesus bore our iniquity upon himself, and yet it says, as a lamb taken to the slaughter, he did not open his mouth. But as well as suffering physically, Jesus also suffered spiritually in a way that we cannot even begin to hope or imagine. He was guiltless, he was innocent, he had no sin, and yet he himself bore our sins and his body on the tree. Christ suffered beyond comprehension, beyond compare. But he was willing to undergo this and to be separated from God in order that we might have access to God's love, to know his mercy and his grace. Crucifixion, redemption, obedience, suffering, S for salvation. Australia and the world at this Easter time 2026 can be likened to a Good Friday place, a place of darkness, of violence, of deceit and death. And perhaps rather than thinking at the time of Jesus' death, darkness had overcome the light and evil had overcome God and his love, we could say instead that God had embraced the darkness, taking into himself the evil, the violence, the ignorance of broken humanity, transforming it. The message of the cross is good news. Peter pronounced before the Jewish religious leaders that salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that is given to men by which we can be saved. For me, that says it all. Salvation, the forgiveness of our sin, the things that we have done wrong, and the promise of an ongoing relationship with Jesus Christ now and forever is God's free gift to us all, made possible through Jesus' death on the cross and 3 days later, his coming back to life. Jesus' final words on the cross were, "It is finished." His mission for coming to earth had been accomplished. In being obedient to God and suffering on the cross, he had paid the price of our redemption, thus making it possible for us to have salvation. Having heard about this, the question to be asked is still, what are you going to do about it? If there's anyone here this morning who hasn't said, "I believe that Jesus has died for me," then I'd ask you to seriously think about doing so. Because as those of us who have made that decision for Jesus know, it's the greatest thing that we can ever do for our life here and now and for eternity. What's the message of the cross? I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Whenever I am tempted to forget that it doesn't matter much to God what I do, or that Christianity is just people doing nice things, I look at that rabbit trap cross. Love cost God a lot. Let's not disregard it or take it lightly.